Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunners Guild, and since Gunlance is a gun, it's going to be included. So Gunlance and Rise is actually a whole lot of fun. It's probably the best iteration of Gunlance we've ever had, so I'm kind of excited to play it and now cover it. That being said, it does have a lot of problems, which I'm going to start the video with, hopefully not to scare anyone away, but just to kind of give you the upfront warning. Before I get into the weapons, playstyles, and sets, I do need to discuss the biggest problem with Gunlance and Rise, and that is its scaling. Now there's almost nothing you can do to scale Gunlance, and that's going to be a big problem in the future for Rise, unless they do something crazy to get it addressed. Gunlance is basically split into two parts, the lance part, and the gun or the shell part. The lance part, which is all your pokes and wide swings and such, works like any other melee weapon in terms of scaling, sharpness, raw, crit boost, all that stuff is going to make you do more damage on your pokes and slaps. That being said, the shelling part, which also includes your wyrmstake and your wyvernfire, can only be scaled off your shell level and the artillery skill. And since we typically don't see shell level increases until G rank versions of the games, that kind of means our Gunlance is pretty much going to do the same amount of damage for all of Rise, regardless of any new weapons or sets we can make. Raw, crit, offensive guard, bludgeoner, all that stuff does not affect your shelling at all. In fact, the only other way to increase your shelling damage, other than Artillery 3, is your ground splitter buff, which is a temporary buff, kind of feels more like a heat gauge than anything. So because of the way Gunlance is working in Rise, the only type of Gunlance that's actually going to be better in the long term is slap lancing, which I will cover in a little bit, but it's kind of a grim realization that that is what's going to be our meta Gunlances eventually. Alright, so with all the doom and gloom out of the way, I will say that Gunlance is still crazy fucking fun, and I love it. So let's dive into the actual basics for Gunlance. I will split this up into each of the types of shells for Gunlance, their properties, the weapons we're going to be using with them, and their sets, because honestly the only weapons that matter are those with the level 5 shells anyway, except for wide lancing. Alright, so normal shells. A Gunlance with normal shells holds 6 total shells, or 7 if you have load shells too. The only Gunlance that we have for normal level 5 is the Rathian Gunlance, so that's always going to be our pick here. Because this type of Gunlance holds the most shells, your main goal is to just dispense of the shells the quickest way you can, which is going to be doing the fullburst loop, which you will need to do the overhead swing, a slam down, and then shell with A for fullburst. And after you do your fullburst, you need to press X to swing again, and then go into your RA quick reload, because if you try to quick reload after the fullburst, you're just going to use wyrmstake. So you kind of got to do it after the swing, and then you quick reload, and then you rinse and repeat. You just got to get into the rhythm of the fullburst loop. That's basically the bread and butter of normal lance. Because most of the normal Gunlance damage is coming from the shells, you kind of have to run Artillery 3 and load shells up for the extra 1 shell. There's nothing else really to scale here, so pretty much everything else is up to you. Bludgeoner and attack boost are great because Rathian's Gunlance has got a huge section of green that will scale very nicely with that. Weakness exploit is always a good option to help your slaps in between your shell rotation, but that's pretty much it for your main skills. With your level 1 slots, you do have a few options. You can use grinder jewels for speed sharpening, because that's always handy. Stun resistance unironically, which I will explain a little bit later. And poison attack up, because like I said, there's not much else you can do to scale your damage, so getting in an extra poison here or there might actually help. Now offensive guard is a good skill, but it does not scale our shells at all, and it doesn't last a whole lot of time, so for how expensive it is and how hard it is to proc with Gunlance, I would just prefer that we upscale our slaps by using bludgeoner and attack for more of a permanent scaling solution. Now you can make this set pretty easily as long as you have a decent charm. Any attack 2 or 3 will cover you, or Wex 2 in some slots you'll be fine. You can also get something like bludgeoner or an artillery charms and then swap around like your Reno pieces for Rathalos or something like that. But either way, it's not hard to mix up this set. Now if you're wondering about guard skills and such, you really don't need them since you won't actually be blocking very much. Evade Extender 1 is so good in this game that the 1 point will actually help you slide out of pretty much any situation and help you reposition just a lot easier. Also, Gunlance has 2 great options for dealing with hits, which is a great segue into our switch skill discussion. So Gunlance has some pretty sweet options for the switch skills actually. Our first choice for normal Gunlance is Blast Stash over Charged Shelling. Since we want a full burst and empty our clip that way, we really don't want to be charging our shells and slowly dumping them one at a time. Blast Stash here is more for just memes flying around. It's actually a great tool to reposition during a fight without sheathing, does pretty solid mounting damage, and you can actually full burst after the overhead swing, which is perfect for normal gun lancing. Now just make sure that when you're trying to fly around, you hold the charge again before you touch the ground so you can use it to reposition. Otherwise you're just going to hit the ground and can only use it once. However, another good mobility option, albeit more difficult and clunky to use, is to have charge shells on and then to cancel out of the charge shell with your back hop and then rinse and repeat. You can move a lot of distance with the Vade Extender and it won't eat your shells, but this is more of a long Gunlance option. So the second switch skill is actually more of the universal one that every Gunlance is trapped into using, which is your ground splitter. So this attack is pretty great across the board. During the animation you have full hyper armor so you won't get interrupted at all, but you can still take damage. This is great for punishing roars or attacks that would otherwise need repositioning to retaliate. The damage isn't terrible either, and you can follow up with a really quick Wyrmstake or slam into full burst. And the cherry on top is that for a short duration afterwards you will increase your shelling and Wyrmstake damage by 15%. This is unfortunately feeling like the heat gauge management in disguise because, as I mentioned, outside of artillery this is really the only thing you can do to scale your shells. So Gunlance is kind of forced and locked into using this thing. Thankfully it's actually a pretty good skill. Oh, and this is also why we're going to be running stun resistance, by the way. Hyper armoring through attacks can still build up stun, so if you keep using this skill you will get stunned eventually. Thank you, Sarah, for that point. The last switch skill we'll be using is the standard quick reload over the guard reload. Now quick reload will let you load back all your shells at once, and you can follow up with your overhead slam and go right back into full burst. Guard reload only reloads 3 of your shells and your Wyrmstake, but does let you block during the animation, which is great. Unfortunately, guard reload cannot follow up with the overhead slam, so it's not really good for full bursting. Now the skill we can't change is our guard edge, which is essentially just a parry that also sharpens our weapon a little bit and does let us follow up with a fast Wyrmstake or an overhead into full burst if we want. The skill is actually pretty amazing, and the sharpness recovery is pretty much saving Gunlance from having to sharpen in a hunt. Alright, so with normals pretty much out of the way, let's talk about long type shells for Gunlance. This feels like the most well-rounded Gunlance in my opinion. They have 4 shells in Rise, or 5 if you have low shell 2 skill. Their charge skills are also very good, and they do get an extra hit on their wyvernfire, which is pretty cool. Because we also have a pretty good clip size of shells, there's really nothing you can't do with this type of Gunlance. Now the only long level 5 Gunlance we have is the dog Gunlance called the Howlitzer, which is a great name and it looks pretty cool too. Now long type shells have a strong charged shelling, which is great because we're going to be utilizing that. So because of that, we kind of always have to use charged shells as our first switch skill. Thankfully though, charged shells also let you go right into a fast Wyrmstake by holding back on the left analog and pressing A. After this we can go right into guard reload, which will reload our shells and our Wyrmstake and let us go right back into charged shelling to rinse and repeat, and this is pretty much our DPS loop here for long shells. Now this is significantly faster than using the normal Wyrmstake, and I basically can't do the normal Wyrmstake anymore. I have to use the shortcut. It feels way too slow. Long Gunlance is also just not about Wyrmstake spam though. It has a very strong wyvernfire, which does block small hits now. It gets an additional hit out of it, and it's half the cooldown as normal or wide's wyvernfire. Also, since its shells are stronger than normal shells, it can honestly full burst spam just as good as normal 5s anyway. You're losing like 10 damage less per full burst compared to a normal 5 Gunlance, and you have all these extra options as well. Long is pretty much your bread and butter Gunlance, and there's not much of a reason to use normal over it. Now you can build an adapter along Gunlance to fit whatever style you actually want to. The only downside here is that the raw of this Howlitzer is a bit lower than the other Gunlances, but still, since that doesn't affect your shells or Wyrmstake at all, it doesn't matter a whole lot. Now for the long set, you technically don't need load shells too if you're going to use Wyrmstake spam, but if you want a full burst you might as well get it in. Focus doesn't really do anything for long shells anymore, we can't charge them any faster, so we don't need that either. It's kind of up to you if you want to use load shells, but you can throw in maybe Bludgeoner or something else for whatever reason. There's not much else to do. Weakness exploit won't do much here either because Wyrmstake and shells can't crit, so it's literally just for your pokes and slaps in between. The charm I'm using is still Wex to attack 2, but you can actually make do without any weakness exploit if you don't have it, or you can just get something similar and put in slots for artillery or load shells or whatever. There's plenty of good armor pieces to move around here. Switch skills are going to be your charge shell to cancel into Wyrmstake, ground splitter because you kind of have to, and guard reload just to reload our Wyrmstake. Alright, so let's talk about the last shell type, wide. Wide Gunlance can only load 2 shells or 3 with load shells too, but does have some extra added perks. Oddly enough, we don't actually want the wide 5 Gunlance in Rise, which is Corn Popper as you may have seen before. Wide 5 shells only deal about 10 more damage over wide 4, and with how little we actually use them, they don't actually make that much of a difference. Plus it has horrendous raw, so even with a shell poke style, we're actually going to lose damage overall. So instead we have 2 options here. The first is the Admiral's Gunlance, which has a nice chunk of blue sharpness, great slots and affinity, Or we can use the Diablo's Gunlance, which will end up scaling much better later into Rise when we have more handicraft to get more white sharpness, and the lack of slots won't hurt as much in the future, I hope. Now, wide shelling is kind of weird in Rise, and I don't really see where they're going with this, because wide can charge 2 levels on their charged shells, which is fine, I guess. It makes them decently strong, but that's it. It doesn't give them KO or anything. Wyrmstake now only does 2 hits, but does get a bunch of KO, so you can potentially get a KO once in a fight, which isn't too bad, but other than that, that's basically it, and you only get like 2 shells, so it's kind of weird. Now, because of the way wide shelling is, the poke shell style of wide lance still works just fine, but since we can't actually scale these shells anymore, it's definitely going to be less useful as time goes on. In fact, the only real style of lance that is future-proof, like I said, is going to be the old slap lance wide style. Just foregoing the shells altogether and playing slaps still does some solid damage, assuming you can still hit weak spots. And it will scale much better with better gear, and you can still use shells for things like blast dashing around. You actually don't need to invest in shells at all if you don't want to. Now, unfortunately, if you want to do the slap lance rotation, you can't use guard reload since it removes your overhead after the reload. You gotta stick to quick reload. Slap lancing works, and I expect will kind of be the meta Gunlance later down the road, just as it was for World. So regardless of what wide lance you're going to use, you will be using the pokes and slaps more than others. So your basic raw scaling stuff like weakness exploit, crit, handicraft, attack, all that stuff is pretty important here. While you don't technically need to worry about sharpness all that much since we can maintain it pretty well with our guard edge Silkbind, having a good buffer lets us use more ground splitters so we can get more damage in and reposition easier. So I do have 2 sets for wide Gunlance. Basically, one is for no shelling and the other is for some shelling. Everything is still using the same attack 2, Wex 2 charm, which isn't huge. You can just get Wex 2 or any other charm similar enough, you'll be fine. You can make pretty identical sets. Now the switch skills here are pretty obvious for wide lance setup. We're going to be using blast dash for positioning, ground splitter because we kind of have to, and quick reload just to get into that slap lance rotation faster. And that's basically all for me in this quick info dump on the Gunlances and the basics of shell types and how we're going to play each one. So yeah, thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters, and whatever you may be hunting.